Welcome to Health Reform 2.0, the only place on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. Here we take you on a journey of our current quagmire, tell you where it came from and why the government can't fix it. Along the way, we'll tell you some history, bust a few big myths, tell you a few stories, and give you an idea how we can work together and get the healthcare system we want. Let's get started. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the next edition of Health Reform 2.0, the only podcast on the internet for people with a curious mind and a desire for a better healthcare system. My name's Tom Locher. I'm joined again, as always, by Tim Henning. Tim is up in the mountains in Lake Tahoe, and I called him this morning and asked him if he had a phone number for Noah, because I felt soon we needed to feel him out about having one of those 2x2 spots in his ark. We've had a lot of rain lately. We need it. But what's going on up there, Tim? How's the rain happening?
The rain's coming down, and it's going to come down for the next 24 hours, but that's okay. We really need it. As you know, we're below our water mark for the year again, so leading into another drought. But I think this is going to help. Not much snow because it's a very warm storm, so most of the ski resorts are now closed, and pretty much wraps up the ski season here on Sunday. Most of the resorts will be closed. So, yeah, it's fine. I can't get to the woods to use my chainsaw for the next few days, but that's okay. It'll give us more time to work on the podcast and on Healthcare Reform 2.0.
Sounds good. So why don't you start us off today, give a little recap of what we covered in the episode we did 1.6 yesterday, and then kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about today.
Great, thank you. So this is a carryover from 1.6, it's episode 1.7. It's still the period from 1930 to 1950. It's a pretty important period because there was a lot of seeds sown there that have affected our medical industrial complex still today. So this is the continuation of chapter 5 of your book. So this was titled New Depression, New Deal, and New War. We're about to get into the new war, but before we do that, we talked yesterday about the Great Depression, some of the FDR's programs, American exceptionalism, Henry J. Kaiser, which we'll talk about more and do a whole segment on there, and what Kaiser is today. So today, before we jump into World War II, one thing I wanted to circle back on, Tom, is a little bit more about FDR's second good deal. Could you help us understand that a little bit?
Well, he did the first New Deal, as you know, to help dig us out of the hole of the Depression and to start to prepare America for the war. He ran into issues with the National Recovery Act, its constitutionality. And by the time that hit, he had started to get traction with the American populace. We're going to talk a little bit in a minute, about the party politics that were going on at the time. But there was a shift happening in American politics, a lot of it driven by the Depression and the concerns about the war. But FDR realized that he had some opportunity here to seat his next election a little bit. So he came up with the New Deal, too, that included a lot of little bits and pieces. There was a national health care initiative. There was a national mortgage initiative. There was a number of things that he wanted to put in place that really began to be along the lines of a social justice movement that he was propagating. The difference between it at his time and our time is two. One is, in his time, he was doing it as temporary programs, again, to rebuild the economy that had been devastated by the collapse of Wall Street. And number two is he was doing it from the mindset of it was now a political initiative for him that he was trying to make go forward. And the view of those things at that time, as an example, insurance, a national insurance program, insurance then didn't mean what it does today. Insurance, the National Insurance Program was in fact insurance as you and I saw it in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, before HMOs, before the expansion of insurance to cover more and more things like office visits and routine maintenance kind of things. The insurance that he was talking about was really catastrophic insurance to help people keep their home in light of a disaster in health.
Mm-hmm. Similar to what some of these catastrophic plans are when Obamacare was enacted, I would assume.
Yeah, and we've had catastrophic plans for years. The biggest problem we've done with catastrophic plans is taking them from dealing with the things we need to stay alive and productive and at least keep some semblance of a life going forward, to adding in all kinds of things that allow us to live a better life. A good friend of mine told me years ago, you know what Medicare pays for? And I said, well, it pays for health care when you get old. He says, no, it doesn't. It doesn't pay for health care. It pays for that new 40-inch television that you bought last year. It pays for the new cars you're buying every 3 or 4 years. It pays for your vacation or a vacation home. He said, back before Medicare started, the people that were making money saved all that money, and if they hadn't saved it, they didn't get the coverage. So people didn't buy things, they sacrificed to save, whereas when Medicare came along and Medicaid in the 60s, by the 70s, they had morphed from an ancillary program to give a little bit of help to a replacement for individual savings and responsibility. So
let me stop you there.
Yeah.
So what you just said is a summary of what I heard from my grandparents and my parents when we talked about the Great Depression.
Yep.
Kind of, sort of, right?
Mine too. And my father told me one time when I was a whippersnapper, I don't know what a whippersnapper is, but I was a whippersnapper. And he said, I'm going to tell you 2 things. Never count on Social Security. It won't be there for you in your elderly years. And don't count on Medicare or Medicaid either. They're going to bankrupt the nation. We couldn't afford Social Security. I thought it was a bad idea when it was going to end in 49. When they made it permanent, I thought it was a really bad idea.
So my guess is you got your snapper whipped more than once and often.
Yeah, I had a lot of snapped whips.
I guess that's where that comes from. I have no idea, but it is very important for us to understand that what is happening now is, people used to pay for their own health care.
Right. Now
we're moving into an era, we're going to talk about it more, of more entitlements, actually.
And another point to this story is the first set of New Deal legislation that Roosevelt put in place was really driven by trying to solve the problem of the short-term problem of people that had been devastated by the Depression and the collapse of the stock market and the economy. And he felt all those things were short-term. But by the time he got to New Deal 2, his motivation to do much of that was really becoming more political. And you'll see another living example of this when we get to the Johnson era after Kennedy's assassination. And you will see, in effect, a duplication of that effort by FDR, which, by the way, his second effort was not successful. In fact, part of the reason was because he died shortly after putting it out and trying to get it through Congress. But Lyndon Johnson took a page, and Lyndon Johnson, Wilbur Mills, Carl Albert, and Wilbur Cohen took a page out of FDR's book in their movement to get the Social Security Act of 1933 extended to include Medicare and Medicaid in '64. So we'll talk about that then. But this is a very important part of the healthcare story. And it's also a very important part of our time in America because it's starting to mark a change in our culture and actually a fundamental shift in our 2 political parties as well, which I think we're going to talk about in a minute.
Exactly. That leads us into World War II, which I also think changed our culture dramatically, changed that period of time. Read Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, which is a good book. I think it leads into a whole set of changes. that affected not only what happened right after the war, our economy, but also what we're going to talk about when we get to the section of 1950 to 1980. So in the last episode, we talked about FDR, as you mentioned, and I think FDR knew, and you agreed with me that war was inevitable. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, he did. He firmly believed not only that war was inevitable, but it was going to fall to America to help to stop the spread of Nazism across the planet.
Yeah, so some of the history books we never been rewritten. There is not much until late of the reasons why Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. I remember when I was learning, all I learned was Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. But Japan and the U.S. had been butting heads for decades before that. Japan had imperial ambitions to expand into China, to solve some of the demographic and economic problems they were facing, and to take over the Chinese import market. We all know that America was against this and responded with trade embargoes and economic sanctions. Sound familiar?
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. Specifically, the oil embargo that America organized with the British and the Dutch. At that time, Japan imported 90% of its oil, so Japan's military could not function. And negotiations had fallen down that had been going on for a very long time. So as war was inevitable, because Japan's only chance was the element of surprise and to destroy the American Navy. So there were things going on in the background for a long time. To go back to a little point that I like to make in many cases, and it's kind of an editorial on my part, is if you look at many of the wars, there's a lot of things, the reason we go to war, for freedom, to free people from a bad regime, which I believe that's the case in some cases. But what I've found mostly is that many of the wars are based on an economic intent. And this is one that, again, has its groundings in economics with Japan. Mm-hmm. I'm not so sure, Nazi Germany was very bad, and I think that's maybe a little different story. But when Japan attacked, they were hopeful that America would accept defeat, that they would destroy the naval fleet.
Right.
Fortunately, as we all know, our carriers were not in Pearl Harbor that day. Thank goodness. But it was still very devastating. And it actually it was kind of similar to 9/11. It woke a country up. I guess at this point in time, when I look back on it, I kind of have questions around some of the things that were done. At that point in time, the American fleet was stationed in San Diego, the Pacific Fleet. Mm-hmm. FDR made the decision to move them to Honolulu, to Pearl Harbor. Now, there's a lot of discussion around this, as if this was contrived, if it was done to provoke Japan. I guess it's a moot point, obviously. It's all over with. But, the move from San Diego to Honolulu of the Pacific Fleet, a lot of controversy was been lately brought up around this. And it wasn't to provoke Japan into the war. And did he know about the attack before that famous day that will live in infamy? Right. We then declared war the next day, both Britain and the United States. And of course, we entered the European operations in January 26, 1942. Right. So what's your thoughts on that, these leading up events to the war with Japan, declaring war on Japan, and to move the fleet, the economic issues revolving around all this, is already understanding that we're going to be in a war, and of course, our movement into the European theater?
Well, there's no way to know for sure the thinking of the small group of people that strategized what they were going to do to move forward, it's often difficult to really sit down and say, is anybody really thinking through this as an economic maneuver or not? This has been attributed to Clinton, attacking a factory in order to get some of the Monica Lewinsky pressure off of him. It's been attributed to Bush, both the first and the second, going after things because they had political issues on the other side. We will see it and have seen it begun to be attributed to Trump for things he's doing. He's got heat over there, so let me go start a war over here. What is unassailable is that America, from its founding, was a nation bordering on bankruptcy, in fact, was bankrupt a number of times. Our economy, our dollar, had not done well from the minute we separated from England. We were under attack economically by France, by England, and by Germany. They didn't want America to become a powerhouse. They wanted America to become a supply dump, as we were for the British. And all of the European countries did well when we were one of the colonies because Britain got the goods from us cheaply. Britain's then sold it to France, and France had some interest here, so did Germany. They all were able to get cheap goods from cheap labor and ship it into Europe and make good money on it. And as we got delusions of grandeur about separating from England, it wasn't really in Europe's best interest to allow that to happen. When we became a nation, up until the War of 1812, we were under significant economic attack because we had let the chickens in the hen house. Alexander Hamilton, in setting up our banking system, had nowhere to go to set up a banking system but to contract to the very same banks that were running the banking system in America when we were the colonies. They were what is now Deutsche Bank and Lloyd's and a number of other, and Rothschilds in France. And he contracted with them to actually set up our banking system. We talked about that in the last episode. When FDR comes along, by the time he comes in, we have a huge economic hole. We have been forced on the gold standard, and the only way we were able to find any way to dig out of the hole was to get engaged in a war. The War of 1812, then the Spanish-American War shortly thereafter, were two examples. When we got involved in the war, we went off the gold standard, and it gave us freedom to print more money and come back, and let's just say it was $1. Really wasn't. It was about 63 cents when we went into the War of 1812. But to make it easy, we'll say it was $1 when we began the War of 1812, and that we had 5 million $1 bills, just to keep it clear. And then at the end of the War of 1812, we had, we'll say, 10 million $1 bills, but we still said it was worth $1. And the world at large really didn't know how many $1 bills there were, so they kind of accepted that. And we doubled the nation's value through the extent of the war. We did it again, as I said, in Spanish-American War. We did it in World War I. And they were good things for America. It was good for America to get involved in war. Frankly, it's good for any economy to get in war that was built around a gold standard or precious metal standard. So when FDR dug out of the economic hole of the Depression, he had been forced into capitulating with the banks, the ones I just mentioned, that now had an organization running them called the Federal Reserve. But, FDR was also a fairly devious and insightful man. He was no slouch. And he took the concept that existed prior in what was called a savings and loan, and he thought, I can use this to expand the savings and loans, to hedge the banks, and make them a more attractive place than the bank to do mortgages. So he stimulated a growth in savings and loans. And when the SEC Act, he broke the wall between the banks and the investment banks, which kind of also crippled the banks a little bit. And in doing so, by 1970s, he had migrated the mortgages in the United States from being owned by banks and investment banks over to being owned by savings and loans. The difference was savings and loans had to lend against the future value of the mortgage, where banks could take $1 of mortgage and lend $9 more against it. So they had a ratio of 10 to 1. That was the way the savings loans got expanded, because if he had told the banks they were going to get the same deal, the banks would have balked. So that was how they went forward. That was a good thing. It was an interesting thing, and it was a masterstroke of setting up something to help our economy. But he took the very same thing forward as he was wrestling with the side of the problem of gold. We didn't have a lot of gold in the U.S., and it was a big problem. So using a similar solution, when he saw the war was about to break, he offered the Allied combatants the ability to purchase supplies and materiel from us for under 2 different programs. One was called Lend-Lease, and the other was called Cash and Carry. And in both of those cases, he was saying to Europe, to England, to France, to various countries in Europe, including some in Russia, some to Russia, you buy your stuff from us, we'll take payment in gold, we'll give you a good deal, and if you can't afford the gold, we'll lend it to you until you have some money, and then it'll be in the form of a lease. You'll do it. Of course, those leases became purchases because we leased you a tank. If the tank blew up, you broke it, you bought it. And that really set America up for the 1950s and 60s, because going into the war, World War I, we had almost no gold reserves in the United States. But by the end of World War II, we had about a little more than 80% of the world's gold supply was sitting in Fort Knox. So this period here was very important in understanding the benefit of the war to America. Roosevelt couldn't take us off the gold standard, so he brought the gold to us.
Well, I guess it's a good thing we won.
Yeah, it would have been, although I would argue it would have been kind of hard for Germany if we didn't win. What would they have done? They would have had to then come to the U.S. and attacked us here and won, because the gold was here. And I think we would have defended that to the nth degree.
I think so. So there's a lot to be talked about in terms of how we came out of that war and the boom years after, because we were the last man standing with any kind of production capability. So from your book, clearly World War II put a lot of men and women in the U.S. either in uniform or in gainful employment. I guess that's what wars do. It also led to the development of a lot of usable forms of new drugs, and we'll talk about that, and preservatives to keep blood readily available. Once again, we talk about medical trauma, technology, and procedures, and the expansion of that trauma technology. And I think most of it, unfortunately or fortunately, we learned on the battlefield. When you and I talk about healthcare in general, and we talk about diseases, we're talking about something different than trauma. Great strides have been made in trauma and medical technologies. We see new injury capability to get to people very quickly and to do things that we never were able to use to do before. Clearly, that was from the battlefield. We have artificial implants today. But that doesn't address the disease part of the discussion that we have. So you want to elaborate that on a little bit?
Well, we made great strides in the war, as you just said. One of the things that we've done very well with is mechanical interventions. So from, the idea of painless surgery to surgically repairing things, those are mostly mechanical processes. They're not biochemical or chemical in nature. But we had some significant strides during the war as well. We learned about trauma surgery. We learned about triage, getting people back quickly during the war, ambulances in World War I, and then even air ambulances in World War II. We learned about artificial implants. Those are all mechanical, structural things to repair the infrastructure of the body, the mechanical infrastructure, physical infrastructure. But there were some good discoveries that came about as we moved after the war. Just before the war, we had found out about penicillin. And penicillin had started to become used a little bit, but it hadn't really gotten into big production. World War II stimulated a rapid expansion of the use and proving of penicillin and actually antibiotics in general. Prior to that, we didn't have antibiotics other than things like silver and poisonous heavy metals that we would use, mercury for gonorrhea, mercury compounds. So, the treatments were always worse. The cure was always worse than the disease they were curing.
I thought we used Listerine for that.
We use Listerine for, and again, I'm more than willing to loan you a cannula and a bottle of Listerine if you think you want to try it.
But I used it to clean the floor. No way.
But shortly thereafter, we came up with penicillin. We started to look for other things. Now, penicillin is an organic derivative of a bacteria, penicillium mold. We also are looking at what are called short chemical forms, which are where many drugs are, as they're pure chemicals. They're not necessarily a derivative of an organic compound from an organism. But we came up with sulfonylamides, which became one of the next big antibiotics that could be given by pill or injection, mostly injection. In fact, we still use sulfonylamides today. When I was a kid, it was found out I was allergic to both penicillin and sulfa-related drugs. Sulfamycin, which was the big one at the time, which left me with very few things they could give me if I got an infection. I had an allergic reaction to penicillin and sulfonilamide. That limited what I could get given by a doctor if I had an infection, and it was one of the known side effects of those drugs. So while they were very effective drugs to take at the time, they did have side effects. They don't have the side effects that people see in drugs today. They're much more dangerous today than sulfonylamides and penicillin, but they still had side effects. We learned a lot about venereal disease during the war. Soldiers overseas, without telling any inside stories revealing inside stories for anybody in the military. They are under stress. Their lives are often at risk, and sometimes when they have nothing else to do, they decide that there's physical activities they want to do that can lead to things like venereal disease. So we upped our game in learning to treat venereal disease from, again, using mercuric compounds or silver nitrate-based solutions into things like penicillin and others as ways to manage venereal disease. Condoms, which had been around for a long, long time, that weren't very effective and were very difficult to maintain. They weren't really made of rubber. They started producing large amounts of condoms for the prevention of venereal disease. We had mental health issues that we started to identify. While they didn't call it PTSD, they called it combat fatigue. But the earliest stages of combat fatigue were done there. There's a famous scene from George Patton slapping a soldier. We got very involved then in terms of propaganda and how to promote the war. That rose out of what we were doing in the country with American exceptionalism, which we spoke about in the last story, which was the beginning of rewriting of our history books to get America to believe we were the only one that could solve the problem. Of course, we had the issue of the ongoing progressive movement that was started with the Bull Moose Party back in Teddy Roosevelt's day. And by the time you get to the middle to late 40s, the progressive era that was driven originally by Republicans had fallen to the wayside and out of favor as a result of the war and the Depression. And a new concept was adopted by the Democratic Party that became a new liberal, quote unquote, liberal philosophy. It's where you start to see the term liberalism replace progressivism. And it became the latest incarnation of the opposite to whatever the conservative party was propagating at the time. And remember, as we've said, the parties have shifted. Republicans and Democrats have shifted throughout the history of the country. What they stood for, their platforms have kind of gone back and forth across each other. But the progressives really had found, Republicans and the Democrats, had found that despite their diligent efforts to clean up the government and government corruption, that it was the innate nature of a free market that left the working class people to be at risk to both the market forces and corruption in government that they expected the government to protect them from. And frankly, the other thing that happened during this period of time, and I think we'll talk a little bit about it, is as we move forward, Roosevelt enacted some things to be temporary that become permanent around 1949. And they basically took the checks and balances on our elected officials and threw them out the window. And our citizen politicians then became a professional political class, as they are in many other countries in one form or another. And it changed the innate dynamic, and we changed the relationship of our political class to the working people and got us kind of in part of the conundrum we have today that clearly is affecting us in healthcare. And then I think the last point of this era was we went through a series of things. One was called the Taft-Hartley Act. Roosevelt had stimulated the growth of unions during the Depression to help get people back to work. And unions had grown and prospered and gained a lot of power in a very short period of time. By the time Roosevelt died, he was working hard to get rid of some of the power that the unions had assimilated. And he is working to pass the Taft-Hartley Act, which got passed by Truman. And the point of the Taft-Hartley Act was to restrict unions and limit the dues that they collect because they had become such a big problem in political power. And of course, the Taft-Hartley Act passed later. But it was an interesting period of time. And a lot of the internal intrigue in the palace and the underlying things below the surface set the stage for the problems that happened to us and the benefits that happened to us in the 50s and 60s and lay the groundwork for where we end up in the 70s when they all really start to change again.
This is a very interesting period of time because when you get into the next chapter, we'll see how these things carried over and are still with us today. I want to go back to a couple things. In World War II, you mentioned venereal disease. Well, that's still with us with STDs in a different form. We talk about how these different diseases, viruses, and things mutate. Syphilis and gonorrhea is a perfect example of that. It's figured out ways around. When I first leave, when I was in the Army, most everyone went into town. I did not. And the next day, when they came back, 75% of the platoon was standing in the infirmary waiting for a shot of penicillin. Not uncommon, right?
Nope, not at all. It's happened in every war. When we get up to the 1950s, we had a large growth of sexually transmitted diseases and some unknown diseases that hit in the 50s that weren't classified until the late 60s, early 70s, which now we think were probably a forerunner of some of the diseases we have with us today. I won't talk about them now. It's kind of a mystery at that point. But it's venereal disease has been a problem of war going all the way back to the Greeks.
Yes, that's very true. I don't quite understand how they dealt with it. Something I haven't gotten into in the ancient history studies. And then the mental health issues, that's what we hear about today. It's got a lot of attention lately. Whether or not we downplayed it or we now recognize it, I'm not quite sure how that evolved and where we're going to go with it, because I'm not sure we have a good understanding and a very solid way of dealing with it. Right. So we'll see how that plays out. It's a very hot topic right now.
Yeah. One other point we may want to make too right now about the gonorrhea and syphilis from World War II versus what we're facing today. To some extent, syphilis has not gotten much more virulent. And the reason is at the beginning of our treatment of syphilis, we found out that if syphilis had inculcated into the body, in other words, if you didn't treat it almost immediately upon getting it, there was almost no way to cure someone of syphilis. And today there still is basically the case. It's almost impossible to cure syphilis once a person has brought it into their body. It's only treatable very early on. If you wait too long, you're going to have an issue. So syphilis didn't really have a lot of treatment. We tried treating it with penicillin. That was marginally effective, like I say, very early on in the infection. But once you had it, penicillin really wasn't used all that much. It wasn't very good. Gonorrhea, on the other hand, penicillin was a magic bullet for gonorrhea and for a couple other sexually transmitted diseases, bacterial, not viral. And as a result, we used it for gonorrhea all the time. And gonorrhea was one of the first diseases that started to show resistance to penicillin as you get into 10 to 15 years of the application of penicillin, you get into the 50s, gonorrhea starts to get a little harder to treat. And we were coming up with new drugs, new forms of penicillin, ampicillin, and other forms of them that we were then using and were giving us an edge on gonorrhea. So let's just assume for a minute we got out of World War II in 1945 to make the math work easy. Here we are at 2018. In 2015, we had the first CDC notification of an untreatable strain of gonorrhea appear in Asia. And today we have an untreatable strain of gonorrhea appearing more widely spread around the world, including some instances in the US. There is no antibacterial, antimicrobial treatment for this disease. It's one of the 14 to 16 diseases that the CDC has on its exceedingly dangerous list. So just because we have a magic bullet doesn't mean that magic bullet is going to be effective 5, 10, 15 years from now.
I think that's a great point. So I hope folks are taking proper precautions and understand this. Because if you look in the history books, there's a number of very famous historical figures that actually died from syphilis over the period of time. So let's get into the next category and the push for the national healthcare insurance. So as we mentioned before, this idea of a national healthcare insurance program, or if you want to call it a single payer system, for no other words, it's been around for a while. So in 1934, FDR's Committee on Economic Security made its recommendation for a state-run healthcare system with mandatory health insurance for all state residents. I understand Congress wasn't very supportive of this, and the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, as well as the AMA was strongly against national insurance. So why was this, Tom? And why did it fail?
Well, it failed for a couple of reasons. Number one is the AMA felt that they had spent, about almost 50 years, close to 60 years, wresting control of the healthcare system in America and putting it firmly in the hands of allopathic physicians. By this time, they were firmly in control of the medical schools. It was the AMA that decided whether you were licensed to practice medicine or not. They had not only control over who could get into medical school, they had control over who could get a medical license when they got out. Even though state by state those things were decided, the AMA was the ultimate arbiter of it. And they thought and felt that this national insurance program was going to cripple the earning potential of doctors, very likely so. And again, remember, this wasn't insurance the way we consider insurance today. This didn't cover office visits. It didn't cover routine things. It only really covered catastrophic stuff. But still, be that as it may, they realized it was going to be a slippery slope. And it was going to put the physicians in a position where the government was going to start to control what they were going to get paid. So they didn't like it very much. And that's one of the main reasons it failed.
And so, in 1926, according to the Farmers Bulletin, I don't know what that publication was, now how accurate it was, but in that bulletin, it said that the average cost of the private hospital room that day was $2.50 per day. In 1947, according to the American Hospital Association, the cost was $8.47 per day, plus extras. However, the average daily income in the United States was only $7.27.
Right.
So lost wages due to sickness, were 4 times larger than the medical expenses associated with treating the illness. In 1949, the average life expectancy had increased from 67 years up from 59 in 1929. So again, we see this incremental improvement up until recently in life expectancy, which is good.
Right. Yeah, there's a couple of things that drove that. One is Kaiser, which we should talk about in a second. But the other is, even though the AMA was against the National Insurance Policy Program, the National Insurance Program, and then it died, it did give rise to a variety of regional physicians associations that had been developed initially as board and care homes by physicians to take control of hospitals. So they expanded into these regional physicians associations, and they started to offer the earlier insurance policies. They were providing some basic form of insurance to kind of forestall the government from doing it. As the nation began to purchase these policies, employers realized that they should pay for them. It would become a way to get a better employee was to offer this as a benefit. And that was the beginning of another opening of Pandora's box we'll talk about later. But it is in the beginning of that a number of things rose up. Number one was these physician-based services that were being offered started to grow into something. And the first Blue Shield was formed in 1939 in California. And Blue Shield, which we know and love today, half of Blue Cross and Blue Shield, offered physician-covered services. They paid money to physicians to take care of you. But they didn't pay for any hospital stuff, because when you went to the hospital, you were really sick, it cost a lot, and they didn't cover it. And by 1949, so that was 39 they started, within 10 years, that symbol of Blue Cross that we see today, Blue Shield that we see today, was now being offered by 9 other regional associations who recognized that this idea that came out of California was very successful. In 1929, 10 years before Blue Shield was founded, Baylor University started providing teachers access to hospital-based services. They didn't cover physicians. You went to the hospital, they did everything they were going to do for you there. And remember, they didn't do everything you wanted. They just did the things you needed, and mostly those things that were going to be catastrophic to keep you working and productive, which was the main reason insurance of that day was being delivered, was to keep people working. If they were working, they were getting paid. That was kind of the idea. And Baylor's idea started to grow fairly quickly and become successful, and it is where Blue Shield came from. One other point to make. The AMA uses the number of physicians being licensed as a cudgel. We talked about cudgels with people last time, but the number of physicians was a cudgel and a way to keep wages high. If they restrict the number of physicians, there were more patients, and the physicians could charge more. And they figured that out, the laws of supply and demand, on the early days. So the AMA has had a long history of restricting the number of physicians coming out in order to get their way. So that was one thing. And what happened at World War II is, while the physicians had been doing this before, when World War II hit, remember, most of the men, and particularly most of the physicians, went overseas. So they're over fighting the war, and there was a drastic lack of physicians in the country. And the AMA decided that it wasn't a problem, because when the war was over, the physicians would come back and everything would be hunky-dory. The problem was, when they made these decisions, it was before these real insurance policies started to take off. That's number one. But by the time the doctors came back from World War II, 2 things happened. One was, more and more people had insurance. A little company that was building dams and bridges, we talked about the last time, named Kaiser, had started to take care of their employees and build a model for that. And America started to get addicted to having some form of insurance coverage to help them pay for health care. So by the time the doctors got back from World War II, there was a lot more patients than there was before. They didn't have enough physicians, and then because these guys came back from overseas and now they weren't with the girls in Europe or in Asia. They were now with the girls in America. And what did we have? We had the baby boom. So
we got you and me.
Exactly. You and I. So
yeah.
the AMA set us up to be behind the curve in number of physicians in the United States, and it continues to some extent today. It's nowhere near as bad as everybody thinks it is, partly because of how our system doesn't operate. But that kind of brings us to, I think, the next point that you're going to want to talk about. Was we got here to where we had really two models, an insurance model and what became the Kaiser model.
Yeah, we talked the last episode again about Henry Kaiser. It's a great story. He was a visionary, a man of principle. I truly believe he had his workers' best interest in mind, but he also realized that he had to have a boost in productivity, gains in efficiency and production. And he soon realized that due to the price and wage restrictions set and enforced by the National Recovery Act, that it would be hard to recruit and keep workers in the steel mills and shipyards. So I think this helped prompt his advancement of his Kaiser Permanente program. And he opened it up to the public, I believe, at large in 1945. And I think that's when the war ended, correct?
Yeah. And Kaiser really did believe that he wanted to take care of his workers, that a healthy worker with a healthy family was a better producer. And we're never going to know whether how much of his brain was because he loved people and how much of his brain was because he wanted to make money and he needed workers to do so. The more I've gotten to understand him, and we'll talk a little bit about him in a political sense in a few minutes, he really did have a good heart for his workers. He cared a lot about his workers above and beyond the fact that the better, healthier the worker was, the more productive they were. He had very strong principles, and he had very, very strong progressive values. In fact, you will meet, and everybody will meet, Henry M. Kaiser, my friend. And Henry M. Kaiser is a lot like his grandfather in our era, which is an interesting conundrum for Henry. But Kaiser Permanente was formed because Henry Kaiser, as he got out of World War II, saw when we ended the war in 45, there was a rapid decline. He had 90,000 employees in his steel yard and shipyard at the close of World War II. Literally within a few weeks, he was down to 13,000 employees. Now, he had an entire infrastructure geared around taking care of 90,000 families, workers and families. It wasn't just 90,000 bodies. It was 90,000 workers and associated families. And he either had to disband this healthcare operation or do something with it. And he decided to do something with it. He created Kaiser Permanente, which is what we have today. And Kaiser Permanente was born. 10 years later, they had over 300,000 covered lives. Now, that sounds like a lot. If you looked at the 90,000 employees he had at the time, he probably had 400 and some thousand covered lives then. But to go from 13,000 when it went away to 300,000 in 10 years, given what was going on in America at the time, that was an absolutely large growth period. It wasn't like they hadn't dealt with that number of lives before. And it really became the first integrated model for healthcare in America. And it's what we call an IDN today. And Kaiser really set up a standard for industrialized medicine that is really something to be marveling at today. Is it the best choice for an American system, a totally American system? I don't believe so. I think we need to have a system that's industrialized, that gives us the care we need cost effectively and efficiently. I also think we need an associated marketplace that's integrated together, that gives us access to the care we want, where we make a true value-based purchase. But Kaiser clearly has half of that model and has been a very, very good provider of it since they founded.
So let me go back to the statement you made about the IDNs. So people that don't know the acronym, it stands for Independent Delivery Network.
Right.
So you'll see organizations such as Sutter, Dignity, Banner, a number of people call themselves IDNs. I think it's a term we've come to accept. One point I want to make, in the I in IDN is probably a misnomer because not very many of them are that integrated, although they like you to believe they are. We'll talk about that in a future chapter. Kaiser, if you looked at the definition today, fits that particular acronym better than anybody.
Exactly.
So we'll talk about how that works and what happened there. What I want to know, though, Tom, is why didn't Henry Kaiser become the Vice President of the United States?
Good question. And Henry Kaiser was FDR's first choice to be vice president when he ran for his second term. Henry Kaiser had become very good friends with FDR. Henry Kaiser was the one that went to FDR when we went into the war and recognized that there was going to be a need to get materiel to Europe efficiently and effectively, and went to FDR and set up the idea that he would build a steel mill and make Liberty ships and deliver them to the government at a cost-plus scenario. And he did. In fact, it is the Kaiser shipyards that produced the Liberty ships that really saved Europe, and particularly saved England by shipping material and goods and supplies to England. And they were running the blockades that Germany was trying to put up. And he built many Liberty ships that really saved England. In fact, it in and of itself is a marvel of engineering. If you look at how they built these Liberty ships, they built them quickly and reliably, and they worked very well. He did it so well that even though he didn't make a normal profit on it, he was considered for a period of time a war profiteer. And he worked really hard to try to get that moniker off his shoulders. But FDR became very fond of Henry Kaiser, and it was FDR who said he was a man that had a find a need and fill it philosophy. FDR wanted him to be the VP, wanted him to run for vice president. The reason he didn't become vice president is because the Democratic Party felt he was just too liberal for America. And FDR couldn't get the power structure within the Democratic Party to approve of Henry Kaiser, and that's how we ended up with Harry S. Truman.
So after FDR passed away and Truman assumed the office, Kaiser wasn't out of politics, obviously. He still did something that was pretty important. He persuaded the Truman administration to do something. What was that, and why was it so important?
Well, employers today and employees should bow down and kiss the statue of Henry J. Kaiser. Henry Kaiser, as we were going, before we really got deeply into the war, Henry Kaiser recognized the value of providing health coverage to mostly women who were left behind. You talked a little bit about it before, that if he provided health care, it was a way to give an incremental value to the workers that would have worked for Levi's making blue jeans, which was a lot less riskier and a lot less dangerous than working in the shipyard building ships or a steel mill making steel to go in the ships. But by offering them, in effect, free health care, he paid them the same wage that they would have gotten in the Levi's factory, but they got the extra benefit. And believe me, the women of America, by the way, Rosie the Riveter didn't work for Levi's. Rosie the Riveter worked for Kaiser. That's that image right there. Yeah. So women recognize the value to their family of healthcare coverage, and it is how he grew his workforce. It's also why his workforce, partly because men were overseas, but it was also why he had a large, very robust, strong women workforce that helped build these ships. He went to Washington, D.C. when Truman got elected and lobbied Truman to say, you need to make it so that employers that give insurance pay for the health care coverage or pay for insurance for health care for their employees, that they get to deduct that from their taxes and earnings. And Truman agreed, and that's where employee-sponsored insurance started to take off, and that's why we have it today.
very important thing that happened there, and I'm glad you were able to elaborate on that. So as we move on, we talked some time ago, a few episodes ago, about the number of hospitals in the United States. And we hit a plateau, I think, of around a little over 7,000 at one point, up from 2,600 about 2 decades before this. And then entered the Hill-Burton Act. And that was kind of the rise of the rural hospital. Can you explain what that act was all about and kind of what happened to the hospital segment during that period of time?
Yeah, in about 1941, we had just under 3,000 hospitals in the U.S. The hospitals existed mostly in cities. Hospitals didn't do well in rural communities because they didn't have, in a rural community, the collection of young doctors coming out of medical school that worked inexpensively, and they didn't have enough of a sampling of any given discipline in care, surgery being one of them, that a hospital could have a full-time, later, like a full-time radiologist or a full-time surgeon or a full-time epidemiologist or a full-time psychologist. There wasn't enough business. That's one. Two, rural communities didn't have access to lots of cash. Most of the transactions, getting all the way up close into the 60s, many people, lawyers and doctors particularly, were not paid in cash. They were paid with braces of chickens and bushels of oysters. They were paid with barter, the things that people could use to trade. So there was not many rural hospitals in America, and there weren't even enough city hospitals. And some of the hospitals that were there were leftovers from the days when hospitals weren't very nice places to be. So they tried getting that National Health Care Act passed. Truman made a great effort at it after FDR died. But he couldn't get it through, frankly, because people recognized it wasn't necessarily going to be a good thing. So the Hill-Burton Act was a way to come up with something to help expand access to care across the country. And that was really what they were trying to do, expand access to care as much as anything else. It wasn't about free care. It was about making sure everybody had access to good quality care. The Hill-Burton Act basically was put up and set in place to stimulate the development of hospitals across the U.S., particularly in rural communities, and setting them up in a way so that they would have subsidies to help make sure that surgeons and others could work in those hospitals, even though the marketplace may not have supported the surgeon himself. A great example is my own uncle, Ford Loker, who was a surgeon in Maryland and Baltimore, and he and a group of colleagues opened up St. Mary's Hospital in St. Mary's County, Maryland. The Hill-Burton Act funded the development of the hospital, and he and his partners would take turns driving down to St. Mary's 1 or 2 days a week to do surgery, and the local physicians then now worked out of the hospital, seeing patients and getting patients there and keeping them in place until the specialist that was needed could come down for a day or two and do practice. So the Hill-Burton Act developed a huge number. In the space of 1941 to 1950, we went from 3,000 hospitals in the U.S. to 6. And as you said, at its peak, we got up to just about 7,000.
Yeah, the rural hospital situation is an interesting one. I'm in a rural area. We'll talk about that because we're going to talk about what Obamacare has done to the rural hospitals and the decline that I see. Actually, just talked to a few of my neighbors yesterday, and they pretty much give up going to the physicians up here. They can't find any. They have to go to Sacramento,
right? Which
is a pretty good haul when you're coming out of the mountains. So, and we tried to solve some of that problem with telemedicine. That didn't work because there's other issues we can talk about. But the rural hospitals today have been taking it on the nose. And the access to specialists is just really important. They're not here anymore. They're gone. I think it's not mistaken, is critical access hospital the same as the rural hospital piece, or did that come after?
It came after, and they're bifurcated now. There's kind of one designation for rural hospitals, there's critical access hospitals, there's disproportionate share hospitals, there's a number of designates out there trying to help stimulate the growth in one hospital or another. And keep access there. But almost all of those determinants have been largely wiped out as a result of the passing of the ACA.
Because I remember back in the day when the critical access hospitals were well subsidized, we provided mobile imaging services to these critical access hospitals. We'd show up and maybe get one patient if we were lucky, maybe two.
Right.
But we still got paid for a day's worth of work.
Yep.
So, there was a lot of subsidies and things that came into that. Now, is it good for the people? Absolutely. You don't see that much anymore. It's pretty much gone away.
Yeah, I think it was good for the people. I think it was bad for healthcare in the long run because much of the money that was being spent in subsidies was being spent to provide an exceedingly expensive access to one individual. And I'm not against providing the care to the one individual, but that money was being spent to get one person care, often not critical, and it was being lost to the people that had a need for the same funding, but for something that was critical that would have helped them stay alive and stay productive. So we have this belief that whatever it is, America can afford it, regardless of what it is. And it's just not true, and it hasn't been true even in the heyday of the 50s when our economy was booming because we had 80% of the gold in the world. And as we moved out of the 50s, as we'll see, when we move out of the 50s, and that gold goes back to who used to have it as they buy it back from us, we ran into some severe economic problems. And this attitude that we can afford anything has now come home to roost because we've built an entire marketplace that thinks we can get whatever we want, we can afford whatever we want, and someone else now mostly should pay for it. And we can't get whatever we want. We barely can afford to get the things we need. And if we don't start to address some of the problems we have right now and efficiency of this system, we're not going to have enough physicians to do it.
I think this brings us to a good segue into our next episode, which will expand upon this particular issue and again the more or less out of control expansion and inflation in the healthcare industry. And so there'll be more topics of discussion about how we actually contributed more to this entitlement program. But in this period of time, as the country moved into the 1940s, several historic advantages contributed to a significant decline in mortality. Mm-hmm. New medications began to arrive in droves, and continued medical and technology discoveries kept happening and prompted huge gains, and importantly, peace of mind. So let's go over some of these advances during this period. The first cardiac catheterization was conducted. Cardiac cath today is pretty much mainstream, multiple cardiac cath labs in most hospitals. And I would tell you that this is probably one of the largest sources of revenues for most hospitals, next to orthopedics. Mm-hmm. The invention and the deployment of the heart-lung machine, the first vaccine for yellow fever in 1935, typhus vaccine in 1937, the development and use of plasma, again, major contribution coming out of the battlefield, I believe.
Right.
First vaccine for the flu.
Yep.
As you mentioned before, penicillin becomes available to the general public. Now, my guess in that statement in your book, it was probably available to the military. Did that come first and then to the general public, or was it kind of together?
Well, it had started to be released prior to the war, but once the war took off, two things happened. They had to figure out how to rapidly scale up production, which they did, and the government helped do that. And, of course, the war consumed the entire supply of penicillin. There was virtually no penicillin available for people in the U.S. during the war. But when the war was over, penicillin was readily available and widely distributed and became very cheap, frankly.
I remember getting it, and I was allergic to it as well. So there you go.
It had allergic reactions to penicillin and sulfamycin were not uncommon. They weren't exceedingly rare. just like today, the side effects of most medications, the rate of side effects are a lot larger than most people think.
So it's interesting how I found out I was allergic to penicillin. So we were in a training exercise in the military. We were unfortunately out in a swamp, and we were knee deep in water and below the water in many cases. So 3 days later, I came down with a severe ear infection. So obviously I go to the infirmary and I get a shot of penicillin. And not shortly after, my face blew up like a watermelon and turned yellow and pink, and I couldn't breathe. And so then I realized that probably not a good thing for me. So it's interesting how you find these things out. And at the same time, we had to develop a treatment for rheumatoid arthritis. So this is going to bring us up to the progressive gains and into the 1950s. It's going to set us up for some of the radicalization and events that we're going to get into in healthcare during the 1960s and 1970s. So I think this is where we'll wrap it up today and pick it up in episode 1.8. And the title of that episode is The Rise of the Disaffected, Disillusioned, and Entitled Generation. It sounds like me. So
you and me both, brother.
This is going to be an episode I've been looking forward to. Done a lot of work on it because I was born in '52. I think you were somewhere after me. And we went through a tremendous amount of cultural change in the 50s to the 1980s. And we're going to get into that because I think it was a turning point in this country and a culture that changed where we are today and had a profound effect on where we are with healthcare. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, your final thoughts, and we'll get ready for the next episode.
We're kissing distance, spitting distance to the modern era, and where most of our lives start to get affected and at least relatable once we get into the 50s. This is going to be an interesting period of time, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. A lot of things happen, and they all are things that we're very intimately familiar with because they really colored what we have today. So I think it's going to be interesting and exciting, and you and I are anxious to get these last couple of chapters of history done so we can start to talk about remediation and how to start to fix what we have and develop a better system. And there's just literally hundreds and hundreds of topics we have notes on that we can discuss. So it's, I'm looking forward to get to the next episode. These episodes, the last two we've done, will be up in the next 5 days, 4 days, 6 days. They'll probably come in 2 different things. It takes a long time to get these things produced as videos after we get them recorded. A lot longer than Tim and I thought when we started putting these together.
That's because of all the mistakes we made.
Exactly. Well, we make a lot of mistakes, but we don't cover them up either. By the way, Tim, just so you know, I'm saving some bloopers that we have, so maybe one day we'll put out a blooper reel. It's pretty funny. Anyway, it's as always, we're just thrilled to death to be here. We thank you for listening to us. We thank you for telling people about us. We are seeing our subscriber base grow because you guys are out telling people about what we're talking about. We're getting likes, which is nice to be liked. Tim and I want to feel like Sally Fields one day. They like us. They really like us. But thank you so much for listening. We look forward to talking to you again, and we'll see you soon. Bye.
Bye.
You've been listening to Health Reform 2.0 with your hosts Tom Locher and Tim Henning. We hope you found the topics interesting, that we answered a few questions, that you laughed a bit and were entertained. Please feel free to invite your friends to join the discussion, and remember, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe. Send us your questions to info@hr20.com. We hope to see you again next time.